Can you imagine being forced to marry an unknown millionaire to save your family from ruin? At only 19 years old, she walked toward the altar crying, while a cold 35-year-old man waited for her with a contract that would seal the fate of two families. What began as a nightmare became the most beautiful love story. Tell me from which country you're watching me. If you want to discover how this marriage of convenience transformed into true passion, subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. The scent of roses from the garden mingled with the salt of tears silently flowing down Sophie's face. At barely 19 years old, she walked slowly toward the improvised altar in the stone courtyard of her family home, each step resonating like the ticking of a clock that would mark the end of her freedom. Her great-grandmother's white dress, preserved in oak chests for generations, weighed on her shoulders like a sentence. The California sky, usually an immaculate blue, was adorned with grey clouds, as if sympathizing with her sorrow. The vineyards, stretching as far as the eye could see around the estate, seemed bowed too, under the weight of the inevitable. On the other side of the path strewn with white petals, Matthew Bennett, a 35-year-old man with a chiseled face, watched her with eyes as cold as steel. His gloved hands held a contract that would seal not only a marriage, but the future of two families in the perfumed hills of Napa Valley. Sometimes the paths we fear most are the ones that lead us exactly where we need to be, her grandmother Mary had whispered the night before, adjusting the veil over her chestnut hair. These words now echoed in Sophie's mind like a prophecy, whose meaning she didn't yet understand. The guests, few in number, observed the scene with a mixture of pity and relief. All knew the price of this marriage, the survival of the Miller wine estate in the family for 7 generations. Sophie's father, Peter Miller, stood straight despite his shoulders slumped with worry. He offered her his arm, his eyes avoiding hers, unable to face the sacrifice he was asking of his only daughter. "You can still back out," he whispered, so quietly that no one else could hear. Sophie clutched the bouquet of lavender and white roses until the thorns slightly pierced her palm. The pain reminded her that she was still alive, still capable of feeling, despite the numbness that had invaded her soul since the announcement of this arrangement. "No, Dad," she answered, lifting her delicate chin. "I won't back down." And so Sophie Miller stepped toward her destiny, unaware that this day she was experiencing as an ending was actually only the first chapter of a story far more complex than she could have ever imagined. 6 months earlier, drought had devastated the Miller family vineyards. What had begun as a difficult season had turned into a catastrophe when the autumn rains never came. Debts piled up like storm clouds over the Mayacamas Mountains, and the only way out offered by the San Francisco Bank came through a man known for his wealth and coldness, Matthew Bennett, owner of the neighboring estates. The Bennett estate now stood before Sophie, imposing with its honey-colored stone towers and olive-green shutters. A month after the ceremony, she still felt like a stranger there, an intruder in a painting she had never been part of. "Does Madam prefer to have breakfast on the terrace or in the dining room?" asked Margaret, the housekeeper with pursed lips, who seemed to constantly judge her. "I'm still not used to being called Madam," Sophie replied, looking out the window at the perfectly maintained garden stretching to the horizon. "And it doesn't matter where, I'll be eating alone anyway, won't I?" Matthew left every morning before dawn to attend to his business, returning only at sunset. Their exchanges were limited to banalities murmured over Limoges porcelain plates in the dining room, where portraits of Bennett ancestors seemed to look down at her with disdain. "The master has his habits," Margaret replied, her tone slightly condescending. "The estate runs according to a rhythm established for generations." Sophie sighed and followed the housekeeper to the terrace. The sun was warmer there, more comforting than under the gaze of the portraits in the dining room. She sat facing the vineyards that stretched as far as the eye could see. Part of it was her family's, now merged with the Bennett estate. This sight tugged at her heart. That morning, as she absent-mindedly buttered a piece of sourdough, she spotted Matthew in the gardens below. He was walking briskly, giving instructions to an elderly man who was frantically taking notes. Even from this distance, she could perceive his rigid posture, his natural authority. He bore no resemblance to the smiling young man she had glimpsed in a photograph in his office, an image taken perhaps 15 years earlier before something transformed his eyes into frozen lakes. "He hasn't always been like this," said a voice behind her, making her start. Sophie turned to discover an elderly woman she had never seen before, Small, dressed in black, she leaned on a carved olive wood cane. "Mrs. Bennet," Sophie stammered, rising hurriedly, almost spilling her coffee cup. "I didn't know you were at the estate." Matthew's mother, whom she had met only once on their wedding day, offered her an enigmatic smile. "I live in the East Wing. I don't come down often." She approached slowly and sat across from Sophie. "My son carries burdens you have no idea about, my dear." "Burdens he has chosen not to share with me," Sophie replied, unable to mask the bitterness in her voice. "Time reveals what haste conceals," said the old lady, observing her son through the window. "Matthew learned very young that love is a luxury some cannot afford." Before Sophie could question her further, Margaret reappeared with a second cup of coffee, and the old lady skillfully changed the subject. But her words had planted a seed of curiosity in Sophie's mind, a first crack in the wall of misunderstanding that separated her from this man she now called her husband. That night, lying alone in the immense four-poster bed of the conjugal bedroom, Matthew slept in an adjoining room. Sophie stared at the ceiling, adorned with delicate mouldings. For the first time since her arrival, she wondered if her golden prison might hide deeper secrets than mere appearances of wealth and tradition. The third month of her marriage coincided with the arrival of autumn. The vines were adorned with gold and purple, offering a spectacle that, despite its melancholy, awakened something in Sophie. Raised among vineyards, she felt the rhythm of the seasons in her blood. That morning, determined to break the monotony of her days, she decided to explore the west wing of the estate, which Margaret had described as unused for years. Curiosity prevailing over caution, she waited until the housekeeper was busy with weekly deliveries to venture into this unknown territory. The corridors of the west wing were narrower, less ornate. Dust danced in the rare rays of sunlight filtering through the closed shutters. Sophie advanced slowly, touching with her fingertips the faded tapestries that told stories of another time. Turning down a corridor, she discovered a half-open door. The dark wood was carved with intertwined vines, a motif that strangely reminded her of the sculptures in the church of her native village. Pushed by an inexplicable intuition, she entered. The room was a private library, smaller and more intimate than the estate's large library. Shelves covered with books rose to the ceiling, and a worn leather armchair faced an unlit fireplace. On a small table, an open book and a half-empty glass suggested a recent presence. Sophie approached cautiously. The book was a collection of poems by Whitman, Leaves of Grass, annotated in a fine, precise handwriting she didn't recognize. Next to it, an open notebook revealed sketches of the property, detailed plans for renovating the vineyards, including modern water conservation techniques her father had always dreamed of implementing. "You found my refuge," said a voice behind her, making her start. Matthew stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. For the first time, Sophie noticed the slight wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, witnesses to concerns she knew nothing about. "I'm sorry," she stammered, backing away. "I didn't mean to intrude. It's your home now, too," he replied, with an unexpected gentleness that disconcerted her. He advanced and gently closed the poetry book. "Although I doubt you consider it as such." A palpable tension settled between them. Not the usual coldness, but something more complex, woven with unspoken words and unexplored possibilities. "These plans," she finally dared, pointing to the notebook of sketches, "they look like the ideas my father—" "Your father is a visionary man," Matthew interrupted, "but unfortunately a prisoner of traditions that prevent him from innovating." Sophie stared at him, astonished. It was exactly what she had always thought, without ever daring to voice it aloud. "You don't know me," he continued, his gaze softening imperceptibly, "just as I don't know you. Our marriage was negotiated like a business transaction, but that doesn't mean we can't find common ground." Before she could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway, and Margaret's voice called them. The moment of vulnerability dissipated as quickly as it had appeared. "Lunch is served in the dining room," Matthew announced, resuming his usual distant, formal tone. "We have guests. The Williams family. Their vineyards border ours to the north." Sophie nodded, but as they returned to the main wing of the estate, she felt that something had changed. For the first time, she had glimpsed the man behind the mask, and this discovery, however minimal, gave her reason to hope. What she still didn't know was that the Williams family was bringing news that would upset the precarious balance of her new life and test the fragile connection that had just been established between her and this man she was just beginning to discover. Lunch with the Williams family took place in a tense atmosphere that Sophie, despite her social inexperience, clearly perceived. Greg Williams, a corpulent man with a well-groomed moustache, spoke loudly and laughed even louder, but his eyes remained vigilant, calculating. His wife Helen, elegant in her navy blue tailored suit, observed Sophie with undisguised curiosity. "So, my dear," said Helen, sipping her wine, "how do you find life as a chatelaine? A radical change from your parents' farm, I imagine?" Sophie felt the barb beneath the apparent politeness. "My parents' property is not a farm, Mrs. Williams, but a vineyard with 7 generations of history, and there I learned the value of work and authenticity." A silence followed her response. Matthew gave her a surprised, perhaps even admiring look before resuming the conversation in a more professional tone. "Greg, you were talking about the export consortium for the American market." The meal continued thus, between business discussions and double-edged remarks. Sophie learned that the consortium in question represented a major opportunity for the region's vineyards, a chance to access new markets in a difficult economic context. After the Williams' departure, as the sun began to set, Matthew invited Sophie to walk in the vineyards. It was the first time he had proposed a shared activity, and she accepted, curious and slightly anxious. They advanced in silence among the rows of vines, the twilight gilding the autumn leaves. In the distance, workers were finishing their day, their silhouettes outlined against the reddening horizon. "The Williams are not allies," Matthew finally said, stopping to examine a bunch of late grapes. "They made an offer to buy your family's lands before our arrangement." "My father never told me about it," Sophie murmured, surprised. "Your father is a proud man. He would rather lose his lands than sell them to the Williams." Matthew turned to her, his face partially shadowed by the setting sun. "There's a history between our families that you don't know about, Sophie." She was surprised to hear him pronounce her name. He usually called her Mrs. Bennet or didn't call her at all. "What history?" she asked, feeling that the answer might illuminate many shadowy areas. Matthew sighed, his shoulders dropping slightly. For the first time, he seemed to visibly bear the weight of his responsibilities. "Our families were once united," he explained. "The Bennets and the Millers owned together what today are our 3 estates, mine, yours, and the Williams. During the Civil War, our great-great-grandfathers, who were brothers, split. One supported the Union, the other the Confederacy. The lands were separated, and a part was seized and later bought by the Williams' ancestors." Sophie listened, fascinated. This story explained so many things: the similar architecture of the 2 properties, certain ancient tools bearing the same emblem she had noticed in the cellars. "The Williams want to reunite the lands, but not to honor the family heritage," Matthew continued. "They want to industrialize production, uproot the old vines to plant more commercial varieties." "And you?" Sophie dared to ask. "Why did you propose this marriage?" The question hung between them, as heavy as the scent of the last ripe grapes. The sun had almost disappeared now, leaving only a thin orange line on the horizon. "I have my reasons," he finally answered, his face becoming an unreadable mask again. "And they are more complex than you imagine." On the way back to the estate, they walked side by side, separated by barely a few centimeters and yet by an abyss of misunderstanding. But in Sophie's mind, the pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, forming an image still blurred but increasingly intriguing of the man she had married. That night, for the first time since their marriage, Matthew knocked on her bedroom door. Not to claim his rights as a husband, as she had sometimes feared, but to give her a book, an old leather-bound diary. "The diary of Mary Bennet Miller, our common ancestor," he said simply. "Perhaps you'll find answers I'm not yet ready to give." Then he disappeared into the dark corridor, leaving Sophie with this unexpected gift and the disturbing feeling that the ground beneath her feet was beginning to transform. A week after the Williams' visit, an autumn storm struck Napa Valley with unusual violence. The wind howled like a wounded beast, tearing away the last leaves from the trees and threatening the most fragile structures on the estate. Sophie stood at her bedroom window, observing the unleashed elements. The spectacle was both terrifying and fascinating, reminiscent of the storms of her childhood, when she would huddle under the covers, listening to her father tell stories to cover the crash of thunder. A lightning bolt suddenly illuminated the landscape, revealing a solitary figure heading toward the estate's outbuildings. Matthew, recognizable by his gait, was fighting against the wind, a bag over his shoulder. Without thinking, Sophie grabbed a shawl and hurried down the stairs. Margaret, who was checking the salon windows, gave her a disapproving look. "Madam shouldn't go out in this weather," she said, her lips pursed. "Where is Mr. Bennet going?" Sophie asked, ignoring the remark. Margaret hesitated. "The West Pavilion has been damaged. The master is going to save what he can." Without waiting any longer, Sophie went out into the storm. The wind momentarily took her breath away, flattening her dress against her body and undoing her carefully styled hair. She advanced painfully, head down to the small stone building located at the edge of the garden. The door was ajar. Inside, Matthew was busy moving wooden crates soaked to the bone. He started when he saw her. "Sophie, what are you doing here?" "I came to help you," she replied, noticing that water was seeping in through a collapsed part of the roof. "What do these crates contain?" He looked at her for a moment, as if weighing the pros and cons of a confidence. "Family archives. Documents, photographs, the history of the Bennets and the Millers." Together they undertook to move the precious crates to a dry area of the pavilion. The work was difficult, the crates heavy and slippery under the rain that was seeping in. As they finished, an ominous cracking sound resonated above them. Without hesitation, Matthew pushed Sophie toward the exit just before a beam collapsed at the spot where she had been standing. They found themselves outside, panting under the pouring rain, their eyes fixed on the partially collapsed pavilion. "You could have been killed," said Matthew, his trembling voice betraying an emotion she didn't know he possessed. "You saved me," she replied simply. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. A mutual recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of a new understanding. "Come," he said finally. "There's a shelter closer than the main house." He guided her to a small stone house nestled between two century-old redwoods. It was a modest but charming structure, with blue shutters peeling from the weather and a small covered porch. "It was originally the winemaker's house," Matthew explained, opening the door. "No one has lived here for years, but I keep it maintained." The interior was simple and welcoming, a main room with a stone fireplace, some rustic furniture, and surprisingly shelves covered with books. Matthew lit a fire, while Sophie discovered the space with curiosity. On a rough wooden table, she noticed sheet music and in a corner, a cello in its case. "You play?" she asked, surprised. He nodded, suddenly ill at ease. "It was my mother's passion. She taught me when I was a child. Why not have an instrument at the main house?" "Some things are too personal to be displayed," he replied enigmatically. The storm doubled in intensity outside, making any return to the main house impossible. In the growing warmth of the fire, they got rid of their wet clothes. He keeping his pants and a spare shirt he had found in a chest, she wrapped in a thick blanket, while her dress dried near the fire. This forced intimacy created a strange atmosphere, as if time had been suspended, allowing a truce in their complex relationship. "I read Mary's diary," Sophie said after a long silence, watching the dancing flames. "She deeply loved her husband, despite their arranged marriage." Matthew smiled slightly. "History sometimes has a sense of irony. She writes that love is not always a thunderbolt, but sometimes a seed that germinates slowly, nourished by mutual knowledge and respect. Do you believe that's possible?" he asked, his intense gaze resting on her. Sophie hesitated, aware that her answer could change the course of their story. "I believe that destiny sometimes places us on paths we would never have chosen, but which can lead to unhoped-for destinations." Lightning briefly illuminated the room, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. Sophie started, and instinctively Matthew placed his hand on hers. "I asked for your hand for reasons you don't yet understand," he said softly, "but I promise you it wasn't solely for the lands or money." Before she could question him further, the cello in the corner caught her attention. "Would you play for me?" she asked. He seemed surprised, then embarrassed. "I haven't played for anyone in years." "Then it will be a fair exchange," she smiled. "You've seen me vulnerable since we met. Perhaps it's your turn." To her great surprise, he agreed, took the instrument from its case and tuned it with precise gestures that betrayed long practice. Then, closing his eyes, He began to play. The melody that rose was of a heart-rending beauty, melancholic yet filled with hope, like a prayer murmured in darkness. Sophie watched him, fascinated by this transformation. Matthew's features had softened, and for the first time, she saw the man he might have been without the weight of responsibilities and secrets. When the last note faded, a silence settled, more eloquent than any words. In the flickering light of the fire, their eyes met again, and Sophie understood that a decisive turn had been taken in their relationship. What she still didn't know was that the next day would bring a revelation that would shake the very foundations of this fragile rapprochement. The day after the storm, the estate offered a scene of desolation. Torn branches littered the paths, part of the enclosure wall had collapsed, and the most exposed vines had suffered. Sophie and Matthew returned to the main house at the first light of dawn, walking side by side in a comfortable silence. The night spent in the winemaker's house had created a new intimacy between them, still fragile but undeniable. "I must go to San Francisco today," Matthew announced as they approached the house. "Urgent business to settle with the bank, following the damage." Sophie nodded, surprised by the pang of disappointment she felt. "How long will you be away?" 2 days, perhaps 3. He hesitated, then added, "You could accompany me if you wish." The invitation took her by surprise. "I'd prefer to stay and help put the estate back in order," she replied, "and visit my parents, make sure everything is all right at their place." He seemed to understand, even respect her decision. "Of course. Tell Peter I'll send men to help him if necessary." They separated in the hall, him going upstairs to prepare his things, her heading to the kitchens to organize the day with the staff. This new dynamic between them, this mutual consideration, warmed Sophie's heart. After Matthew's departure, she decided to tackle the damaged pavilion. Despite Margaret's protests, she insisted on personally supervising the rescue of the family archives. Accompanied by 2 estate employees, she spent the morning sorting through the documents that had escaped destruction. It was in the late afternoon, as the light was fading, that she discovered a metal box hidden under the debris of a shelf. The box was locked, but the fall had bent the mechanism. Carefully, Sophie managed to open it. Inside were official documents bearing the seal of a Swiss bank, as well as a bundle of letters tied with a frayed ribbon. Her instinct told her to close the box, put it back in its place, and wait for Matthew's return. But a more powerful force, perhaps the same one that had pushed her to accept this marriage, led her to untie the ribbon and unfold the first letter. "My dear Matthew, I understand your desire to honor your father's promise, but the price to pay seems too high to me. The Miller family is on the verge of ruin, certainly, but an arranged marriage with their daughter does not guarantee that history will not repeat itself." The letter, signed by a certain Lawrence Baker, a lawyer in San Francisco, continued for several pages, detailing what appeared to be a complex financial plan involving the 3 estates, Bennett, Miller, and Williams. Sophie went through the other letters, her heart beating faster and faster. They revealed a truth she would never have suspected. For years, Matthew had been financially supporting numerous families in the region, including hers, through anonymous loans granted via a foundation based in Switzerland. The last letter, dated a few weeks before their marriage, contained a phrase that took her breath away. "Your decision to marry the Miller girl to save their estate is noble, but I fear it will not be enough. The Williams know about your illness, and they are simply waiting for nature to take its course." His illness. Sophie reread the passage several times, looking for clarifications, but the letter said no more. What illness? Was Matthew in danger? With trembling hands, she put the letters away and closed the box. The sun had set, plunging the pavilion into darkness. A sense of urgency suddenly seized her. She needed to talk to someone who knew the truth. Without taking the time to warn anyone at the estate, she rushed to the stables, saddled a horse herself, and galloped off toward her parents' property. Night had fallen when she arrived. The family home, more modest than the Bennett estate, but infinitely warmer in her eyes, shone with the light of oil lamps. Her father, alerted by the sound of hooves, was waiting for her on the porch. "Sophie!" he exclaimed, astonished. "What's happening? Is it Matthew? Has he hurt you?" "No, Dad," she replied, dismounting. "But I need answers. The truth this time." Peter Miller, aged by worries but still dignified, held her gaze for a moment before sighing deeply. "Come in," he said simply. Your mother is already asleep, but we can talk in my study. Her father's study hadn't changed. The smell of leather bindings, the waxed wood of the desk, the maps of the plots pinned to the wall. Sophie sat in the armchair where, as a child, she had listened to her father tell her the history of their vines. I found letters, she began without preamble. They say that Matthew was helping us financially long before our marriage, and that he is sick. Is it true? Peter poured himself a glass of brandy before answering. Yes, it's true. Matthew began helping us anonymously after his father's death 5 years ago. I only discovered it recently. Why didn't you tell me anything? Because he made me promise, her father replied, his gaze weary. He wanted you to marry him thinking he was just a cold, calculating businessman. He said it was easier that way. Easier for whom? Sophie flared up. And his illness, what is it? Peter hesitated. It's not for me to tell you, my daughter, but know that Matthew is not the man you think. Behind that distant facade hides someone deeply good, who carries the weight of a complex family legacy. Sophie stood up and walked to the window. In the distance, she could see the lights of the Bennett estate, shining in the night like distant stars. Why did he really propose this marriage? She finally asked. Her father joined her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. To honor a promise made to his dying father, to reunite the lands that should never have been separated. And perhaps, he hesitated again, perhaps also to leave a legacy, something that would endure after him. This enigmatic response only fueled Sophie's determination. She had to return to the estate, confront Matthew upon his return, demand the whole truth. I'm going back, she declared, kissing her father. Sophie, Peter called as she reached the door. Don't judge Matthew's secrets too harshly. We all do what we can with the cards life deals us. On the way back, galloping under a starry sky, Sophie felt her heart transform. The initial anger at the discovered secrets gave way to a more complex emotion, a mixture of compassion, curiosity, and, more unsettling still, admiration for this man she was beginning to see in an entirely new light. What she didn't know was that at that moment in San Francisco, Matthew was making a decision that would upend their common destiny in a way neither of them could have foreseen. San Francisco gleamed under the fine rain of that autumn evening. From the window of his hotel room, Matthew observed the city lights reflecting in the waters of the bay. He held a medical file in his hand, the same one he reread every month for 2 years, hoping each time for a miracle that never came. Mr. Bennett? Called a voice behind him. Dr. Watson, a specialist in cardiology, was waiting patiently, his professionally neutral expression barely masking his concern. Forgive me, Matthew replied, turning to him. You were saying? I was saying that this new experimental treatment could offer you a few more years, perhaps more if we're lucky, but we would need to start immediately and plan for surgery within 3 months. Matthew nodded slowly. His heart disease, hereditary and long asymptomatic, had brutally manifested itself on the day of his father's funeral. A cruel irony of fate, as if the Bennett heart couldn't bear the weight of grief. And the side effects? He asked, already knowing the answer. Significant, unfortunately, intense fatigue, risks of infection. You will have to considerably slow down your activities. The doctor hesitated. Have you spoken about your condition to your wife? At the mention of Sophie, Matthew felt his failing heart dangerously accelerate. The image of the young woman in the firelight, that night of the storm, kept haunting him. Her natural grace, her lively intelligence, her resilience in the face of adversity. So many qualities he hadn't anticipated when he had proposed this arranged marriage. No, he admitted. She thinks she married a man in perfect health to save her family's estate. She has the right to know, the doctor gently insisted, especially now that you must make a decision regarding this treatment. After Dr. Watson's departure, Matthew remained motionless at the window for a long time. He had organized his life since his diagnosis as a condemned man, settling his affairs, ensuring the future of the estate, honoring the promise made to his father to reunify the ancestral lands. The marriage to Sophie had been just a step in this meticulous plan. At least, that's what he had repeated to himself to justify having tied the fate of an innocent young woman to his own. But these last few weeks, something unexpected had happened. Feelings he thought he had forbidden himself had begun to germinate. His phone rang, interrupting his reflections. It was Lawrence Baker, his lawyer and childhood friend. "The Williams have made an offer for the northern parcels," Lawrence announced without preamble. "They know about your health, Matthew. Someone at the hospital talked." Matthew clenched his fists. "How much?" "An indecent amount. They think you're desperate, that you're looking to liquidate before—" Lawrence didn't finish his sentence. "Refuse. I won't sell a single acre." "Matthew," his friend sighed, "be reasonable. If you choose this new treatment, the medical expenses will be astronomical. Insurance won't cover everything." "I've made my decision," Matthew cut him short. "I'm returning to the estate tomorrow. Prepare the documents for the property transfer." "The transfer? To whom?" "To Sophie. I want everything in her name, legally unassailable." A stunned silence followed this declaration. "You trust her that much?" Lawrence finally asked. Matthew smiled weakly. "It's not a question of trust. It's a question of justice. She deserves to choose her future with or without me." After hanging up, Matthew took a small worn leather notebook from his suitcase, his personal diary he had kept since adolescence. He opened it to a blank page and began to write, the words flowing as if they had been waiting forever to be freed. "My dear Sophie, when you read these lines, you will already know the truth I have hidden from you. I don't ask your forgiveness for this lie by omission. Some secrets seem easier to bear alone, but I owe you the truth about my feelings." He wrote for a long time, filling page after page with confidences never made, hopes never expressed. He wrote like a man who knows his time is counted, with a brutal honesty and a surprising tenderness. At dawn, exhausted but with a clearer mind than it had been in months, he made his final decision. He would call Dr. Watson to accept the experimental treatment, not out of fear of death, which he had learned to accept, but for a reason he would never have thought possible, the hope of a future with Sophie. He was unaware then that while he was making this decision, Sophie had discovered part of his secret and was preparing for a confrontation that would forever change the course of their shared history. The Napa Valley sky had regained its clear blue when Matthew returned to the estate. 3 days had passed since his departure for San Francisco, 3 days during which Sophie had lived in a state of constant agitation, oscillating between anxiety, anger, and a more troubling emotion she didn't yet dare to name. She waited for him in the main library, sitting upright in a leather armchair, the letters discovered in the pavilion resting on her knees like evidence. Through the window she saw the black car coming up the cypress-lined driveway, her heart accelerating despite herself. When Matthew entered the room, she was struck by his appearance. He seemed paler, more tired than when he left, and yet there was a new intensity in his gaze that momentarily disoriented her. "Sophie," he said simply, stopping at the threshold, visibly surprised to find her there. "We need to talk," she replied, her voice firmer than she would have believed possible. He nodded, gently closing the door behind him. "I agree, I have many things to tell you." "I found these," she interrupted, showing the letters. "In the pavilion after the storm." Matthew paled further, if that was possible. He approached slowly and sat in the armchair facing hers. "So you know. I know that you helped my family in secret for years. I know there's a history between our families that goes beyond the simple question of lands." She hesitated, then added, "And I know that you are sick. What I don't know is why you married me while hiding all this from me." A heavy silence settled. Outside, the song of cicadas seemed strangely loud, as if nature itself was holding its breath. "Where to begin?" he murmured, more to himself than to her. Then he straightened up, as if making a decision. "My heart is failing, Sophie. A congenital malformation that my father also had. The doctors gave me 2 years, maybe 3 with luck. That was 2 years ago." The shock of this revelation, despite the clues she already had, took her breath away. "And now there's a new treatment. Experimental, risky, but which could offer me more time." He had a joyless smile. "That's why I was in San Francisco." "Why not tell me before our marriage?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I had the right to know what situation I was getting into. Would you have accepted if you had known?" The question caught her off guard. Would she have agreed to marry a condemned man? The answer wasn't as simple as she would have believed a few weeks earlier. "I don't know," she admitted honestly, "but I would have preferred to have the choice." Matthew rose and walked to the window, contemplating the vineyards that stretched to the horizon. "I have transferred all the properties to your name," he announced suddenly. "The estate, the lands, the bank accounts, everything is yours now, legally and irrevocably." Sophie stared at him, dumbfounded. "Why would you do that?" He turned to her, and for the first time since they met, his face was completely open, vulnerable. "Because I want you to be free. Free to stay or to leave. Free to sell or to keep the lands. Free to continue this marriage or to end it." "That's not an answer," she insisted, rising in turn. "Why marry me in the first place? Was it only to honor a promise to your father?" "At the beginning, yes," he admitted. "I wanted to reunite the lands, preserve the family heritage, ensure that the Williams wouldn't destroy what our ancestors had built. And now?" The question floated between them, charged with all the possibilities they had never dared to contemplate. "Now," he murmured, approaching her until their breaths mingled. "Now I want to live, Sophie. For the first time in years, I truly want to live. And that's thanks to you." Before she could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. Margaret entered hurriedly, looking worried. "Forgive me, but Mrs. Bennet Sr. has had a fainting spell. The doctor is on his way." Matthew and Sophie exchanged a glance. Their crucial conversation would have to wait. They followed Margaret to the East Wing, where Matthew's mother had lived in seclusion for years. In the austere room with perpetually drawn curtains, the old lady lay pale as death on her canopied bed. At their entrance, she weakly opened her eyes. "Matthew," she murmured, "you've returned and you've brought your wife." "Mother," he said, kneeling beside the bed, "the doctor is coming. Rest." The old lady shook her head slightly. "No time for that." "Sophie, come closer." Hesitantly, Sophie approached and took her mother-in-law's outstretched hand. She was surprised by the strength that these skeletal fingers managed to exert. "In my desk," the old lady whispered, "the bottom drawer. The key is under the pillow. Take it now." Sophie exchanged a perplexed look with Matthew, who seemed equally surprised. Obeying, nevertheless, she found the small silver key and opened the indicated drawer. Inside was a carved wooden box. "Bring it here," the old lady ordered weakly. Sophie placed the box on the bed. The elderly lady opened it with precise gestures despite her weakness. Inside, a necklace of emeralds and white gold softly gleamed in the dimness of the room. "This has belonged to the wife of the master of these lands for 5 generations, she explained. "I never wore it because I never truly loved my husband, nor was I loved by him. Our marriage was just a business alliance." Her pale eyes fixed intensely on Sophie. "But you, my dear, have accomplished what I thought impossible." "And what is that?" Sophie asked, troubled. "You have made the walls my son had erected around his heart fall." A faint smile illuminated the wrinkled face. "I've been watching you since your arrival. I've seen the changes in him. Changes he doesn't yet fully recognize himself." She closed the box and handed it to Sophie. "Take it. It's rightfully yours, not by marriage, but for what you have awakened in my son." The arrival of the doctor interrupted this strange moment. Sophie and Matthew were asked to leave the room during the examination. In the hallway they remained silent, each absorbed in their own thoughts. The revelations of that day whirled in Sophie's mind: Matthew's illness, the property transfer, the enigmatic words of her mother-in-law. "What did she mean?" she finally asked. "What changes has she seen in you?" Matthew looked at her for a long time before answering, as if searching for the right words to express something he was just beginning to understand himself. "For years, I've lived as a condemned man, Sophie. I've managed businesses, maintained estates, honored traditions, but I haven't truly lived." He took a step toward her. "Until you arrived with your freshness, your courage, your way of seeing beauty where I saw only obligations." He extended his hand, brushing her cheek with a hesitant caress. "I believe my mother has seen what I refused to admit, that I'm falling in love with you, Sophie Miller Bennet." This unexpected declaration left her speechless. Before she could respond, the doctor exited the room, looking grave. "It's just a passing exhaustion," he announced, "but at her age one must be vigilant. She should stay in bed for a few days." This interruption broke the moment of intimacy. Matthew rushed to his mother's bedside, leaving Sophie alone in the hallway, the box containing the ancestral necklace clutched to her heart, and the echo of his declaration resonating in her mind. That evening, isolated in her room, Sophie contemplated the starry night through the open window. The day had brought too many revelations, too many emotions for her to assimilate all at once. Yet amidst this storm of contradictory feelings, a certainty was slowly emerging. Her own feelings for Matthew had changed, evolving from resignation to curiosity, then to something deeper she didn't yet dare to name. Tomorrow they would have to resume this interrupted conversation. Tomorrow she would have to decide if she was ready to love a man whose future was as uncertain as the wind blowing over the hills of Napa Valley. Autumn was gradually giving way to winter. The vines, now stripped of their leaves, resembled rows of gnarled hands stretched toward an often grey sky. At the estate, a fragile routine had been established since Matthew's declaration. Sophie and he had resumed their interrupted conversation the day after his mother's fainting spell, but words now seemed insufficient in the face of the complexity of their situation. They had agreed to a sort of truce, a space to truly discover each other, far from the obligations that had defined their relationship until then. That morning, Sophie was preparing to accompany Matthew to his first treatment at the San Francisco hospital. The night before he had seemed nervous, almost vulnerable when he had asked her to come with him. "I understand if you prefer to stay at the estate," he had added hastily, as if fearing a refusal. "I'll come," she had replied simply, touched by this rare manifestation of uncertainty. As she finished dressing, a sound of breaking glass, followed by a cry, resonated on the ground floor. Alarmed, Sophie rushed down the stairs. In the hall, she found Matthew collapsed on the floor, unconscious, Margaret kneeling at his side. "He suddenly stopped talking and collapsed," explained the housekeeper, her face pale. "I've called an ambulance." The hours that followed unfolded like a nightmare for Sophie. The ambulance, the rush to the hospital, the aseptic corridors where incomprehensible announcements resonated, and above all, the waiting, interminable, anguishing. Dr. Watson, arriving urgently from his clinic, finally explained the situation to her. Matthew's heart had suffered a major failure, probably triggered by stress. His condition was stabilized, but fragile. "Can he still receive the experimental treatment?" Sophie asked, surprised by her own technical knowledge of her husband's medical situation. "It's riskier now," the doctor admitted, "but it's also become more necessary. We'll start tomorrow if he wakes up in a satisfactory state." If he wakes up. These words resonated in Sophie's mind like a death knell. For the first time, the possibility of losing Matthew became tangible, and with it came the brutal realization of her own feelings. Sitting at his bedside in the hospital room, observing his pale face and the machines that monitored his vital signs, Sophie became fully aware of the obvious. She had fallen in love with this complex man, with his secrets, his wounds, and his nobility of soul hidden beneath an apparent coldness. "You should go home to rest," suggested a nurse, entering to check the monitors. "These chairs are terribly uncomfortable for spending the night." "I'm staying," Sophie replied, determined. "I don't want him to wake up alone." The nurse smiled with compassion. "You love him very much, don't you?" The question, asked with a disarming simplicity, deserved an equally simple answer. "Yes," Sophie admitted, voicing aloud what she had just acknowledged to herself. "I love him." Late in the night, as the hospital had plunged into a relative silence, Matthew finally opened his eyes. His gaze, at first confused, fixed on Sophie, who was dozing, her hand still in his. "Sophie," he murmured, his voice barely audible. She woke with a start, relief flooding her face. "Matthew, how do you feel?" "Like a truck ran over me," he tried to joke, but his smile transformed into a grimace of pain. Sophie pressed the call button to alert the nurses, then leaned toward him. "You scared me so much." "I'm sorry," he murmured, weakly squeezing her hand. "It wasn't part of the plan." A nurse entered, quickly followed by the doctor on duty. Sophie was asked to leave the room during the examination. In the hallway, she called Lawrence Baker, Matthew's lawyer, to inform him of the situation. "I'm taking the first flight," he announced. "And the Williams?" "The Williams? What do they have to do with this?" An embarrassed silence followed. "They called yesterday to renew their purchase offer. Apparently, they heard about Matthew's hospitalization almost immediately." This information deeply troubled Sophie. How had the Williams been informed so quickly, and why rush to make an offer at such a time? When she was authorized to return to Matthew, she found him more alert, though visibly exhausted. "The doctors say I can start the treatment in 3 days," he announced. "Apparently my heart is as stubborn as I am." Sophie sat on the edge of the bed, hesitant. "Matthew, Lawrence told me about the Williams. How did they know about your hospitalization?" His expression darkened. "They have informants everywhere. That's how this family has operated for generations, exploiting others' moments of weakness. What do they really want? It can't be just the lands." Matthew sighed deeply. "It's an old vendetta, Sophie. The Williams were once tenant farmers on our lands. During the Civil War, they took advantage of the chaos to appropriate a part of the estate, claiming they had rights to it. Since then, each generation has attempted to absorb what remains of the Bennett Miller lands." He briefly closed his eyes, as if talking exhausted him. "But there's more to it. Under the northern parcels, those bordering their property, there's an underground water source. In a region increasingly affected by drought, this water is worth gold. And they know about it? They suspect it. My father discovered the source shortly before his death. We kept the information secret, planning a sustainable irrigation system that would benefit all the vintners in the valley, not just us." This revelation explained many things: the Williams' persistence, their haste to take advantage of Matthew's illness, their constant presence like vultures waiting for their moment. "What can we do?" Sophie asked, feeling a new determination rise within her. Matthew smiled weakly, touching her cheek with his fingertips. "You say we? That's already more than I dared hope for." Before she could respond, the door opened to reveal Lawrence Baker, who had arrived sooner than expected. The lawyer, a thin man with square glasses, seemed both relieved and concerned. "You look terrible," he said to Matthew by way of greeting. "Always so diplomatic," Matthew replied with a weak smile. "Sophie, Lawrence and I need to discuss some legal details. Could you—" "I'm staying," she interrupted him firmly. "No more secrets, Matthew. We had an agreement." The two men exchanged a glance, then Matthew nodded. "You're right. Lawrence, speak freely. Sophie is now fully involved in all our affairs." The lawyer took several documents from his briefcase. "The Williams have gone on the offensive. They're contesting the validity of the property transfer to your wife, claiming that you weren't mentally competent to make such a decision due to your illness." "That's ridiculous," Sophie flared up. "The transfer was done legally, with witnesses." "Yes, but they filed a request for a retroactive psychiatric evaluation," Lawrence explained. "It's a low blow, but it could block any transaction or decision regarding the lands for months, even years." Matthew clenched his fists, a flash of anger crossing his usually calm gaze. "They hope I won't last that long." A heavy silence followed this declaration. Sophie felt her heart tighten in the face of such calculated cruelty. "There's something else," added Lawrence, visibly uncomfortable. "They've contacted Thomas." Matthew paled further, if that was possible. "My brother. How did they find him?" "Who is Thomas?" Sophie intervened, surprised to hear for the first time that he had a brother. "My younger brother," Matthew explained, his voice suddenly weary. "He left the estate 10 years ago after an argument with our father. I haven't heard from him since. The Williams have apparently proposed an arrangement to him," continued Lawrence. "If he also contests the property transfer as a legitimate heir, they guarantee him a substantial share in the future sale of the lands." This accumulation of bad news suddenly seemed too heavy for Matthew. The cardiac monitors went wild, and almost immediately a medical team rushed into the room, asking Sophie and Lawrence to leave. In the hallway, Sophie collapsed onto a chair, her face in her hands. The situation seemed desperate. Matthew's health, the Williams' threats, the appearance of this unknown brother as a new pawn in a cruel chess game. Lawrence sat next to her, looking dejected. "I'm sorry, I should have presented things more gradually." "No," Sophie replied, raising her head. "Matthew is right. No more secrets, even if the truth is painful." She fixed the lawyer with a new intensity. "Now tell me everything I need to know to protect my husband and our lands. Because I assure you, Mr. Baker, the Williams will get neither as long as I'm alive." Lawrence looked at her with a mixture of surprise and admiration. He now saw what Matthew must have perceived in her, not the naive young woman who had been sold to him as a temporary solution, but a formidable ally whose quiet strength might well be their best asset in the battle that was shaping up. 2 weeks had passed since Matthew's hospitalization. The experimental treatment had begun, bringing with it its exhausting side effects, a crushing fatigue, persistent nausea, and sometimes pains that wrung grimaces from him that he vainly tried to hide. Sophie had settled into a demanding routine, dividing her time between the hospital and the estate, where she had taken charge of daily management with an assurance that surprised even Margaret. The late harvest had concluded under her supervision, and the first winemaking promised an exceptional vintage, despite the year's difficulties. That morning, she was returning from her daily visit to the hospital, her heart lighter than usual. The doctors had announced that Matthew could return to the estate in a few days to continue his treatment as an outpatient. As she passed through the gate, she noticed an unfamiliar car parked in the courtyard, a luxury sedan with New York plates. Intrigued and slightly worried, she quickened her pace. In the great hall, a man stood facing the portrait of Matthew's father. Tall, slender, dressed with a casual elegance that betrayed an urban ease, he had his back to her. "May I help you?" Sophie asked as she entered, her tone oscillating between politeness and wariness. The man turned slowly. The shock immobilized her. It was like looking at a younger, more carefree version of Matthew. The same aristocratic features, the same grey eyes, but animated by a different light, more volatile. "You must be Sophie," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thomas Bennet, the prodigal son returned to the fold." "Mr. Bennet," she replied coldly, remembering what Lawrence had revealed at the hospital. "What a surprise to see you here after so many years of absence." Thomas gave a brief, joyless laugh, direct and honest. "I understand why my brother chose you." He made a gesture encompassing the room. "The estate hasn't changed, still as suffocating." "Your brother is in the hospital," Sophie said, refusing to enter his game. "But perhaps you already know that since you're here." Thomas's smile faded. "Yes, I'm aware. The Williams contacted me." He approached the window, observing the distant vineyards. "They made me a very generous offer. To betray your brother and your family heritage," Sophie completed, unable to mask her contempt. Thomas turned to her, his expression suddenly harder. "What heritage, Mrs. Bennet? That of a tyrannical father who broke everything he touched? That of a family who clings to lands and traditions at the expense of the human beings who make them live?" The vehemence of his reaction surprised Sophie. Behind the casual facade visibly hid a deep wound, never healed. "I don't know your story," she admitted more gently. "But I know Matthew, and the man I've discovered these last few months is not the one you describe. My brother has always been the perfect heir," Thomas replied bitterly. "Ready for any sacrifice to honor the paternal will, even at the cost of his own happiness." This observation, strangely close to what she herself had thought at the beginning of her marriage, shook Sophie. "People change," she said simply. Thomas observed her for a moment, as if gauging her. "You really love him," he noted, half surprised, half intrigued. "That wasn't in the contract, though." "Life often exceeds the contracts we think we sign," she replied, holding his gaze. "Will you accept the Williams offer?" The direct question seemed to destabilize him. He turned away, approaching the fireplace where a discreet fire burned. "I don't know yet," he finally admitted. "I came to see for myself what remains of my family. Of this estate I fled like the plague." An idea suddenly germinated in Sophie's mind. "Come with me," she said impulsively. "Let's go see your brother. Now." Thomas seemed surprised by this unexpected proposal. "I doubt he wants to see me." "Perhaps, but you've both lived 10 years with preconceived ideas about each other. Isn't it time to confront these ideas with reality?" Something in her tone, a quiet authority, a sincere conviction, seemed to touch Thomas. After a moment of hesitation, he nodded. The journey to the hospital unfolded in a tense silence. Sophie observed Thomas from the corner of her eye, noting his growing nervousness as they approached their destination. Beneath his casual airs hid a man visibly anxious about this confrontation. When they entered the hospital room, Matthew was sitting in an armchair near the window, an open book on his knees. At the sight of his brother, he froze, his face becoming an unreadable mask. "Thomas," he said simply, his voice neutral, betraying no emotion. "Matthew," his brother replied, equally sober. Sophie observed the two men looking at each other like strangers, while they shared the same blood, the same features, the same heritage. The absurdity of this situation suddenly struck her. 10 years, she said, breaking the icy silence. 10 years without a word, without a visit, And now you stand facing each other like two diplomats from warring countries." She shook her head. "I'll leave you. Talk to each other, shout at each other if necessary, but for pity's sake be honest with each other." With these words she left the room, gently closing the door behind her. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, hoping she had made the right choice in provoking this confrontation. An hour passed, then two. Sophie waited patiently, refusing to leave without knowing the outcome of this meeting. Finally the door opened, and Thomas emerged. His eyes reddened, but his expression strangely pacified. "He's asking for you," he said simply, before walking away toward the exit. Matthew was waiting for her, visibly exhausted, but looking more serene than she had seen him in a long time. "How did it go?" she asked gently, sitting beside him. "We talked," he replied, a sad smile on his lips. "Really talked, perhaps for the first time in our adult lives. There's a lot of pain, a lot of misunderstandings to undo. Will he accept the Williams offer?" Matthew slowly shook his head. "No. Thomas has his faults, but betrayal isn't one of them. He also has some interesting revelations about the Williams and their methods in New York." He took her hand, squeezing it with a surprising strength for a convalescent man. "Sophie, I don't know how to thank you. For everything you do, for the estate, for my mother, and now for bringing back my brother." She smiled, intertwining her fingers with his. "It's not a sacrifice, Matthew. It's a choice. My choice." For the first time in weeks, a real hope shone in Matthew's eyes. Despite his illness, despite the threats that still hung over them, something had changed. A broken bond had been repaired. An unexpected alliance had formed. What they still didn't know was that Thomas Bennett, in returning to the family estate, was bringing with him not only crucial information about the Williams, but also a professional expertise that would prove decisive in the battle that was brewing. Matthew's return to the estate coincided with the first frosts of December. Sophie had prepared his room with special care, transforming it into a space both functional for his care and comfortable for his convalescence. Carefully selected books were stacked on the bedside table, and she had a small desk installed facing the window, knowing he would hate feeling useless. To everyone's surprise, Thomas had stayed. He had settled in the West Wing, far from the room he had occupied in his youth, as if to symbolically mark his new place in the family, present but different, returned but transformed. That morning, as Sophie was organizing the end-of-year holiday preparations with Margaret, Thomas burst into the kitchen, brandishing a newspaper. "You need to see this," he said, spreading the regional daily on the table. The front-page article announced the creation of a regional wine consortium led by Greg Williams, aiming to modernize agricultural practices and optimize water resources in a context of climate change. "It's their first public move," Thomas explained. "In New York, I worked for an environmental lobbying firm. I know their strategy. They present this consortium as an ecological initiative, when in reality it's a maneuver to control access to water." Sophie reread the article, noting the carefully chosen terms to mask the true intentions. "They mention a partnership with international investors. Do you know who they are?" Thomas nodded gravely. "An American investment group specializing in the acquisition of natural resources. Their business model is simple: buy lands with water reserves, then resell access to this water at a high price to neighboring owners." "We need to talk to Matthew about this," Sophie decided, but Thomas placed a hand on her arm. "My brother needs rest. His treatment exhausts him, and every upset affects his heart." He hesitated before adding, "Perhaps we could handle this ourselves, at least initially." This suggestion surprised Sophie. She observed her brother-in-law carefully, trying to determine his real motivations. Thomas had changed since his first visit. The cynicism was still present, but it was now tinged with a sincere concern for his brother, and surprisingly, for the estate he had once fled. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked cautiously. An enigmatic smile appeared on Thomas's face. "I have some contacts in New York who could be useful to us, and I think it's time to organize a small meeting with the other vintners in the valley, those the Williams haven't yet approached." The idea was bold but sensible. By uniting the small producers, they could create a counterpower to the Williams consortium. "Matthew won't appreciate being sidelined," Sophie warned. "He'll appreciate even less learning that we let the Williams gain ground during his convalescence," Thomas retorted. "Let's trust that he'll understand we're acting in his interest." Thus began an unlikely collaboration between Sophie and Thomas. In the days that followed, they discreetly contacted the owners of neighboring estates, organizing a meeting in the old vaulted cellar of the estate, far from indiscreet ears and the Williams' gaze. "My friends," Sophie began, standing before them with an assurance she hadn't known herself to possess a few months earlier, "we are all facing unprecedented challenges: drought, rising costs, pressure from large groups that would like to transform our ancestral methods into standardized industrial processes." She explained the situation regarding the underground water source, Matthew's initial project to create a shared irrigation system, and the Williams' maneuvers to appropriate this vital resource. 12 vintners responded to the call, men and women with faces weathered by the sun and worries, representing estates of various sizes, but sharing the same concerns about climate change and threats of resource monopolization. "What they propose is not a partnership, but a takeover," Thomas intervened, taking over with the ease of a man used to professional presentations. "We propose an alternative, a true cooperative, where each estate would retain its independence while equitably sharing water resources and infrastructure." A silence followed this proposal. Then Johnny Freeman, whose family had cultivated 5 acres for 6 generations, spoke up. "The Williams have already approached me. They offered a decent price for my lands, but something in their haste made me uneasy." He nodded towards Sophie. "I prefer your vision, Mrs. Bennet. But do we have the means to resist their consortium?" "Together, yes," Sophie affirmed with conviction. "Our strength lies in our union and in the quality of our products, not in quantity or economies of scale." The discussion continued late into the night, addressing the practical, financial, and legal aspects of such a cooperative. To Sophie's surprise, Thomas proved to be a valuable asset. His years in New York had brought him not only useful contacts, but also a fine understanding of economic mechanisms and influence strategies. When the vintners finally left the estate, all had signed a preliminary agreement, committing to seriously explore the creation of this cooperative, and to refuse, in the meantime, any offer from the Williams. Sophie accompanied the last guest to the gate. The night was clear, the Californian sky overflowing with stars that seemed brighter than ever. A sense of accomplishment filled her. For the first time since her marriage, she was acting not out of obligation or resignation, but out of deep conviction. Returning to the estate, she was surprised to find Matthew in the hall, wrapped in a thick robe, looking exhausted but alert. "I had a visitor today," he said without preamble. "Greg Williams in person. He seemed particularly upset." Sophie felt her heart accelerate. "Matthew, I can explain." He raised a hand to interrupt her. "Thomas has already told me everything. Your little secret meeting didn't go as unnoticed as you hoped." She prepared for reproaches, aware of having acted without his explicit approval. But to her great surprise, Matthew approached and gently took her face in his hands. "Sophie Miller Bennet," he said, a flash of admiration in his gaze. "You never cease to amaze me. In a few months you've accomplished what I've been trying to do for years." "We've simply continued what you started," she replied, moved by this unexpected contact. "No," he insisted. "You've done much more. You've united people who have distrusted each other for generations. You've given new hope to this valley. And," he hesitated, searching for words, "you've brought back my brother, not just to the estate, but into my life." In this moment of shared vulnerability, something fundamental changed between them. It was no longer the arranged marriage between a sick man and a sacrificed young woman, but a true alliance between two people who were discovering, appreciating, and perhaps loving each other. "The Williams won't give up easily," Sophie warned, aware of the challenges that still awaited them. "No," Matthew agreed, "but they will now have to face not a weakened man, but a united family and a supportive community." His gaze intensified. "And I intend to be present for this battle, Sophie. I promise you." This promise, pronounced in the gentleness of a winter night, sealed a pact between them, a commitment that far exceeded the terms of the contract they had signed 6 months earlier, when Sophie walked toward the altar with a heavy heart and eyes full of tears. What they still didn't know was that their greatest challenge was yet to come, and that it would arrive from a direction they hadn't anticipated. Winter had fully settled in Napa Valley, wrapping the bare vines in a mantle of frost that sparkled in the pale January light. Matthew's treatment, was following its course, with ups and downs that now rhythmed life at the estate. Days of extreme fatigue alternated with moments of renewed energy, during which he actively participated in the preparations for the new cooperative. The relationship between Sophie and Matthew had evolved toward a deeper intimacy, made of nocturnal conversations, cautious walks on the estate when the weather permitted, and comfortable silences during which they read, side by side, in the library. They now shared the same bedroom, although Matthew's illness limited their physical intimacy, a frustration they compensated for with a growing tenderness in their daily gestures. That morning, as Sophie was reviewing the cooperative statutes with Lawrence Baker, Margaret burst into the study looking alarmed. "Ma'am, it's the master. He received a call from the hospital and has locked himself in his room. He refuses to open or answer." Sophie rushed upstairs, her heart pounding. For weeks they had been awaiting crucial test results that would determine the effectiveness of the experimental treatment. "Matthew?" she called softly, knocking on the door. "Please open up." Only silence answered her. After several unsuccessful attempts, she used the emergency key that Margaret kept for urgencies. The room was plunged into dimness, the curtains drawn despite the morning hour. Matthew stood before the window, motionless as a statue, his silhouette outlined against the light. "The results have arrived," he said without turning, his voice strangely detached. "The treatment isn't working as hoped." Sophie approached slowly, as one approaches a wounded animal. "What exactly do the doctors say?" "That my heart continues to weaken despite the treatment." He finally turned to her, his face marked by a resignation that broke her heart. "They propose another option, a heart transplant. But the waiting times are long, and my complex condition reduces the chances of finding a compatible donor quickly." Sophie absorbed this information, refusing to give in to the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. "Then we'll wait. We'll fight. There must surely be other treatments, other specialists." "Sophie," he interrupted her gently, taking her hands in his, "I must be realistic. The doctors are talking in months, perhaps weeks." These words hit her like a physical blow. "No," she murmured, shaking her head. "I refuse to accept that. We've only just found each other, Matthew. There must be a solution." He pulled her to him, enveloping her in an embrace that seemed to want to imprint every contour of her body in his memory. "My brave Sophie," he murmured against her hair, "always ready to fight, even when the adversary is invisible." They remained thus embraced, time suspended in this room that suddenly seemed isolated from the outside world. Then, gently, Matthew drew back and guided her to the bed where they sat side by side. "I've made a decision," he announced, his expression becoming that of the determined man she had learned to know. "I want to live fully the time I have left, without being defined solely by my illness." "What do you mean?" "I want to pursue the cooperative project. I want to see the vines turn green in spring. I want to dance with you under the stars." A sad smile illuminated his face. "And I want you to promise me something." "Anything you want," she replied without hesitation. "Promise me to continue after me, to take care of the estate, the cooperative, our common heritage, not out of obligation or duty, but only if it makes you happy." The request was simple yet heart-rending in its implication. Sophie felt tears rising, but she held them back, knowing that Matthew needed her strength, not her grief. "I promise," she said, her voice firm despite the emotion gripping her. "But you must also promise me to fight, to the end, for us, for everything we've started together." He nodded solemnly, sealing this pact between them. The days that followed were marked by a new intensity, as if each moment was amplified by its precariousness. Matthew became more involved in the life of the estate, sharing with Sophie and Thomas his knowledge accumulated over the years. Together they planned the future of the cooperative, outlining the contours of a project that could transform the entire valley. One evening, as Sophie was working late in the study, Thomas came to find her, looking unusually grave. "I may have a solution," he announced without preamble. "For Matthew." She raised her head, instantly alert. "What solution?" "There's a clinic in Boston, specializing in complex cardiac cases. They have experimental protocols that aren't yet approved in California." He placed a file before her. "I've done discrete research. Their success rate is remarkable, but—" "But what?" Sophie pressed, already eagerly scanning the documents. "It's extremely expensive. And there's no guarantee that Matthew will be accepted into their program. Sophie closed the file, a new determination shining in her eyes. Money isn't a problem. I'll sell my jewelry lands if necessary. That won't be necessary, Thomas interrupted with an enigmatic smile. I have some savings set aside. And more importantly, I have contacts who could facilitate his admission. Sophie looked at him, surprised by this unexpected offer. Why would you do this? I thought you and Matthew— We've had our differences, Thomas admitted, but he remains my brother. And these last few months have reminded me what family truly means. He hesitated before adding, I also have a debt to him, a debt he doesn't know exists. What debt? Thomas sighed deeply, as if a long-carried weight was finally lightening. When I left the estate, I was lost, angry. I made questionable choices, debts, unsavory people. One day, when I was at my lowest, a lawyer came to find me with a sum of money sufficient to start over, and a simple message: do something good with your life. Matthew, Sophie murmured, recognizing in this gesture her husband's discreet generosity. I only discovered it recently talking with Lawrence Baker. Matthew saved me without asking anything in return, without me even knowing. Thomas straightened his shoulders. It's time I returned the favor. The plan they developed that night was bold. Contact the Boston clinic, prepare Matthew's medical file, and above all, convince him to accept this chance, which might prove the most difficult, knowing his pride and his reluctance to hope. The next morning they presented the idea to Matthew, who, as expected, initially refused categorically. It's madness, he argued, seated in the armchair near the window where he now spent his mornings. These private clinics exploit the desperation of the sick by selling illusory miracles. Not this one, Thomas insisted, handing him scientific articles and testimonials. Their methods are innovative but solid, and you have nothing to lose by trying. Accept my dignity, and a fortune that could be better used for the future of the estate. Sophie knelt before him, taking his hands in hers. Matthew, listen to me. When we married, I thought I was making a sacrifice to save my family. Then I discovered in you a man I could respect, admire, and now— Her voice trembled slightly. Now, I love you, and I'm not ready to give up on our future together, without having tried everything. These words, this declaration she had never formulated so explicitly, seemed to touch Matthew more deeply than all the rational arguments. His eyes softened, and he brought Sophie's hand to his lips. So you truly love me, he murmured, as if he could hardly believe it. With all my heart, she confirmed, her eyes shining. So do you agree to give us this chance? After a long moment of silence, Matthew slowly nodded. For you, for us, I accept. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. While Thomas took care of the arrangements with the Boston clinic, Sophie and Matthew intensified their work on the cooperative, determined to set it up before his departure. The Williams' reaction was not long in coming. Sensing that their strategy was threatened by this unexpected alliance between the Valley's vintners, they launched a legal offensive, contesting the legality of the cooperative and redoubling their efforts to acquire strategic lands. One February evening, as the date of departure for Boston approached, Sophie found Matthew in the winter garden, contemplating a solitary white rose that had miraculously survived the frosts. It reminds me of you, he said, hearing her approach, delicate in appearance but of a surprising resilience. Sophie smiled, touched by the comparison. Roses have thorns to protect themselves. I've learned to do the same. Tomorrow we'll sign the final documents for the cooperative, he continued, changing the subject. And the day after tomorrow we leave for Boston. There was in his voice a note of anxiety Sophie had never heard before. Not the fear of death, which he had learned to accept, but perhaps the greater fear of disappointed hope. Everything will be all right, she affirmed, as much to reassure him as to convince herself. If this treatment fails, he began, but she placed a finger on his lips. We mustn't think like that. We must believe in the future, Matthew. For the first time in our life together, we have the right to dream. In the intimacy of that winter evening, surrounded by the subtle scent of dormant plants and the promise of spring to come, they finally allowed themselves to share these dreams. Of children, perhaps, of travels, of future harvests, of anniversaries celebrated together in the old winemaker's house they had decided to restore. The next day, as planned, All the vintners of the valley gathered at the estate for the official signing of the cooperative statutes. The atmosphere was solemn but joyful, charged with a cautious optimism in the face of the uncertain future. As the notary was preparing the documents, Greg Williams made a notable entrance, accompanied by two men in dark suits. "I'm sorry to interrupt this charming meeting," he announced with a smile that belied his words, "but I have here a court injunction forbidding any signature until the question of land ownership is resolved." A worried murmur ran through the assembly. Sophie felt Matthew stiffen beside her, his hand instinctively seeking hers. "On what grounds?" asked Lawrence Baker, immediately taking control of the situation. "Potential fraud," Williams replied, with evident satisfaction. "We have reason to believe that the property transfer to Mrs. Bennet was made while Mr. Bennet was not in full possession of his mental faculties given his medical condition." The blow was low, calculated to do maximum damage. Sophie saw several vintners exchange uncertain glances, the fragile trust they had built threatened by this unexpected development. It was then that Thomas stepped forward, his expression calm but determined. "Mr. Williams, I fear you've made the trip for nothing." He took an envelope from his jacket. "This is a certified copy of a document I filed with the court yesterday, my official renunciation of any right to the Bennet inheritance, accompanied by a sworn statement confirming my brother's full mental capacity at the time of the property transfer." A stunned silence greeted this announcement. Williams, visibly destabilized, almost snatched the envelope from Thomas's hands. "This isn't over," he threatened after quickly scanning the document. "We have other recourses." "No doubt," Matthew calmly intervened, rising with a dignity his illness had not diminished. "But while you waste your time in legal maneuvers, we are building something that will outlive you, Williams. A community, a shared vision of the future." His words, pronounced without anger but with a quiet conviction, seemed to touch the assembly. One by one the vintners rose, symbolically forming a rampart around Matthew and Sophie. "We will sign these documents," declared Johnny Freeman, the dean of the vintners, "with or without the court's approval, and we will honor this commitment among ourselves, as our ancestors did before the very existence of written laws." Williams left the meeting, defeated for the moment, but visibly determined to continue the battle. After his departure, the signing took place in an atmosphere of renewed solidarity. Later that evening, as they prepared their luggage for Boston, Sophie found Matthew contemplating his father's portrait in the great hall. "Do you think he would be proud?" she asked softly. Matthew smiled, a smile imbued with the wisdom hardly acquired these last months. "I don't know. But for the first time in my life, I realize that his approval is no longer what guides my choices." He turned to her, taking her face in his hands. "It's your gaze I seek now, Sophie. Your happiness that gives meaning to my actions." That night, despite his fatigue and physical fragility, they loved each other with the desperate tenderness of those who know that each moment is precious, each touch potentially the last. At dawn, as they prepared to leave the estate for a journey whose outcome remained uncertain, Sophie cast a last glance at the vines, sleeping under the morning frost. Whatever followed, one thing was certain. She was no longer the terrified girl who walked toward an altar of sacrifice. She had become a woman who had learned that true love, like great wines, could be born from the most improbable circumstances, provided it was given time to reveal its depth and complexity. The Harmony Clinic, nestled in the outskirts of Boston, looked more like a luxury hotel than a medical facility. Large bay windows offered a spectacular view of the Charles River and the city skyline, while the staff, discreet and efficient, moved silently through the bright corridors. For Sophie, these surroundings represented both a hope and a constant anxiety. 3 weeks had passed since their arrival, 3 weeks during which Matthew had undergone a battery of tests, then begun an innovative treatment, combining gene therapy and regenerative medicine, an approach aimed at repairing his failing heart rather than waiting for an uncertain transplant. That morning she waited in the lounge reserved for families, absently leafing through a magazine without really seeing it. Matthew was undergoing new tests to evaluate the first effects of the treatment, and despite the doctor's cautious optimism, anxiety didn't leave her. "Mrs. Bennet?" She looked up to discover Dr. Weber, the chief cardiologist, a man in his 60s with a kind gaze behind round glasses. "How is he?" she asked immediately, jumping to her feet. The doctor smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "We're observing a significant improvement. The cardiac cells are beginning to regenerate, and ventricular function has stabilized." Sophie brought a hand to her mouth, not yet daring to believe this news. It means the treatment is working, Mrs. Bennet. Your husband is responding remarkably well to the protocol." Dr. Weber adjusted his glasses. "There's still a long road ahead, and we'll need to continue the treatment for several months, but for the first time since I've known his case, I'm truly optimistic." Tears of relief filled Sophie's eyes. After so many months of uncertainty, this glimmer of hope seemed almost unreal. "May I see him?" "Of course, he's waiting for you in his room, and—" The doctor hesitated, an enigmatic smile on his lips. "He has a surprise for you." Intrigued, Sophie headed to Matthew's room. When she opened the door, she remained frozen on the threshold, astonished. Matthew was standing by the window without assistance, dressed not in the robe he usually wore, but in a simple, elegant suit. On a small table, a bouquet of wildflowers and a bottle of champagne waited in an ice bucket. "Sophie," he said simply, his gaze bright with contained emotion. "You're standing," she murmured, abandoning for the first time the formality that had characterized their relationship until then. "Without help," he smiled, approaching her with a slow but steady step. "Dr. Weber authorized me to be up longer today, for a special occasion." "What occasion?" Matthew took her hands in his. "Exactly 1 year ago today, I saw you for the first time in the notary's office in San Francisco. You were wearing a simple blue dress, and you didn't meet my gaze once during the entire meeting." Sophie remembered that day perfectly. The humiliation, the fear, the feeling of being sold to save her family. "I was terrified," she admitted. "And I was fascinated," he confessed. "Even then, behind your apparent resignation, I perceived a strength I envied." He brought her hand to his lips. "Today I received 2 pieces of news that change everything. The first you already know, the treatment is working." "And the second?" she asked, her heart pounding. Matthew released her hands to move to the bedside table, from which he took a small velvet box. "The second is that, against all odds, I have a future ahead of me. A future I want to share with you, no longer out of obligation or arrangement, but by choice." He opened the box, revealing a ring set with an emerald surrounded by small diamonds. "Sophie Miller Bennet, would you marry me again? This time for love?" Emotion overwhelmed Sophie like a wave. This ring, this moment, represented everything she had never dared to hope for. A free choice, a true love, a shared future. "Yes," she answered, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." Matthew slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into an embrace that, for the first time since they had known each other, was not tinged with the fragility of illness, but with the promise of healing. They celebrated this rebirth with the champagne Matthew had prepared, savoring this moment of pure happiness after so many trials. Through the window they could see the first signs of spring awakening in the valley below, a renewal that echoed that of their own story. The phone rang, interrupting this moment of intimacy. It was Thomas, calling from the estate with mixed news. "The Williams have finally shown their true colors," he announced without preamble. "They tried to divert water from the source to their lands by installing pumps during the night." "Did they succeed?" Matthew asked, concerned. "No. Johnny Freeman caught them and alerted everyone. The cooperative reacted as one man. Within hours, all the vintners were there, forming a human barrier around the source." Thomas couldn't hold back a satisfied laugh. "You should have seen William's face when he realized he wasn't intimidating anyone anymore." "And legally," Sophie worried, "Lawrence has filed a complaint for attempted theft of natural resources. With the testimonies and photographic evidence, the Williams are in a bad position." A pause, then Thomas added, "But that's not all. Their American investors have withdrawn from the project when they learned of the potential bad publicity. Williams is isolated." This news, although encouraging, reminded Sophie that their battle was not over. The estate, the cooperative, everything they had built together remained fragile, requiring their presence and commitment. After the call, Matthew seemed to read her thoughts. "We'll have to return soon, won't we?" "The treatment," she began, concerned, "can continue in California, according to Dr. Weber, with regular visits here for adjustments." He approached the window, contemplating the landscape. "I feel our place is there, Sophie. With our vines, our family, this community we've helped create." She nodded, recognizing the truth of his words. Their story had begun in the hills of Napa Valley, among the vines and under the California sun. It was there that it should continue. 2 weeks later, after obtaining the doctor's authorization and organizing rigorous medical follow-up, they left Boston to return to the estate. The journey was slow, punctuated with stops to allow Matthew to rest, but each mile brought them closer to home, a concept that had taken on an entirely new meaning for Sophie. When they finally passed through the estate's gate, a surprise awaited them. The main driveway was lined with villagers, vintners, estate employees, all applauding their return. Banners wishing welcome back and long live the cooperative floated in the spring breeze. Thomas stood on the porch accompanied by Matthew's mother, who had left her seclusion for the occasion, and Sophie's parents. This vision, their two families united awaiting their return, embodied all they had hoped to accomplish. "Welcome home," Thomas said simply as he greeted them. That night, after the celebrations and emotional reunions, Sophie and Matthew found themselves alone in their bedroom. Through the open window, the scent of the season's first flowers entered, carried by a light breeze. "Look," said Matthew, pointing to the vines stretching under the moonlight. "The first buds are appearing. In a few months it will be harvest time. Our first harvest together," Sophie murmured, leaning against him. "The first of a long series." Matthew enfolded her in his arms, his body stronger than it had been in months. "Who would have thought, when you were walking toward that altar in tears, that we would end up here?" Sophie smiled, turning her face toward him. "My grandmother always said, sometimes the paths we fear most are the ones that lead us exactly where we need to be." "Your grandmother was a wise woman," Matthew murmured before tenderly kissing her. On that quiet night, in the heart of an estate that had survived generations of joys and sorrows, Sophie and Matthew savored this simple but profound truth. Sometimes destiny offers us exactly what we need, even if it takes the form of what we fear most. The September sun bathed the vines in a golden light, making the ripe clusters of Cabernet Sauvignon and Pinot Noir waiting to be harvested sparkle. The air vibrated with excitement. It was the first day of the harvest, and the entire Bennett Miller estate was buzzing with activity. A year had passed since the return from Boston, a year of progressive healing for Matthew, of consolidation for the cooperative, and of profound transformations for the estate. The Williams, discredited after their attempt to divert water, had finally sold their lands to the cooperative, thus completing the reunification of the ancestral properties that Matthew's father had so desired. Sophie, dressed in a simple summer dress and a straw hat, was directing a team of harvesters in the south parcel. At 30, her hands had slightly hardened from daily work in the vineyards, but her face radiated a confidence and serenity she would never have believed possible 2 years earlier. "Mom, look what I found!" A little girl of about 4 years was running between the rows of vines, proudly brandishing a particularly voluminous bunch of grapes. Her chestnut hair, identical to Sophie's, danced in the sun, and her grey eyes, those of her father, sparkled with joy. "It's magnificent, Eleanor," Sophie exclaimed, kneeling to admire her daughter's discovery. "You should show it to your father. He should be near the winery." The little girl nodded vigorously before running off again, her white dress floating behind her like the wings of a butterfly. Sophie watched her go, her heart overflowing with love. Eleanor had been born 9 months after their return from Boston, the fruit of their renewed love and living symbol of the hope that had replaced despair in their lives. Following her daughter at a distance, Sophie headed toward the winery, where Matthew was supervising the arrival of the first harvests. At 40, he had regained almost all his former vigor. The experimental treatment continued to take effect, and although regular visits to Boston remained necessary, the doctors now spoke in decades rather than months. She found him bent over a vat, discussing with the cooperative's winemaker. Seeing her approach, his face lit up with a smile that even after 2 years of true marriage still made her heart beat faster. "The harvest is looking exceptional," he announced, welcoming her with a light kiss. "The analyses show a perfect balance between sugar and acidity." "A great vintage, then?" she asked, naturally slipping her arm under his. "The best in decades, according to Johnny Freeman, and he's seen his share of harvests." Eleanor reappeared, now perched on Thomas's shoulders, who was making her laugh uproariously by imitating a horse's gallop. The uncle and niece had developed a touching complicity, Thomas finding in this role a dimension of himself he had never explored before. "The guests are starting to arrive for the festival," he announced, approaching. "Mother is already settled under the pergola with Sophie's parents." The Harvest Festival was a tradition that Sophie and Matthew had revived the previous year, a moment when all those who worked on the estate, as well as the members of the cooperative and their families, gathered to celebrate the fruit of their common labor. The sun was beginning to set when they joined the large courtyard of the estate, where tables had been set up under the century-old redwoods. Strings of lights gently twinkled, waiting for night to fall to reveal their magic. The smell of freshly pressed grapes mingled with the aromas of thyme and rosemary that perfumed the traditional dishes prepared for the occasion. Mrs. Bennet Sr., whose health had remarkably improved since she had left her seclusion, presided over a table where she was telling stories of the estate to the marveling children. Her once closed face was now animated with a rediscovered joy, particularly when her granddaughter Eleanor climbed onto her knees to demand, "Another story from the old days, Grandma." Sophie's parents, seated nearby, observed this scene with a mixture of satisfaction and wonder. Peter Miller, whose shoulders had straightened since the weight of debts had disappeared, was cheerfully toasting with former competitors who had become partners within the cooperative. "Who would have thought," he murmured to his wife, "that this marriage we so feared would bring not only the salvation of our estate, but also such happiness for our daughter?" His wife smiled, squeezing his hand under the table. "Love sometimes finds strange paths, my friend." At the other end of the courtyard, Thomas was busy near an improvised stage, helping local musicians set up their instruments. Since his return, he had found his place within the estate, not as a vintner, the land had never been his passion, but as the head of commercial development for the cooperative, putting to use his New York contacts and his marketing experience. Sophie approached him, 2 glasses of wine in hand. "A little liquid courage before your speech," she proposed with a knowing smile. Thomas accepted the glass with gratitude. "I still can't believe you convinced me to speak in front of everyone." "You're the public face of our cooperative now," she replied, "and you do it remarkably well." He took a sip, appreciating the complex aromas of the wine produced the previous year. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't returned." "Everything happens for a reason," she said simply, as my grandmother Mary used to say. "The paths we fear most are the ones that lead us exactly where we need to be," Thomas completed with a smile. "I'm beginning to believe your grandmother was right." As the sun disappeared behind the hills, bathing the valley in a purple light, the tables were moved to create a dance space in the center of the courtyard. The musicians began a traditional Californian melody, and soon couples and families joined the dance. Sophie searched for Matthew with her gaze and found him a bit apart, observing the scene with a contemplative expression. She approached silently, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. He squeezed her hand, his eyes not leaving the joyful spectacle before them. "I'm thinking about the first time I saw you, walking toward that altar, silent tears flowing down your cheeks. I'm thinking about how certain I was then that our marriage would never be more than a transaction, a practical arrangement." He turned to her, his gaze intense. "I never would have imagined all this." He made a gesture encompassing the illuminated courtyard, the dancers, their daughter twirling among other children, laughing uproariously. "Do you sometimes regret?" Sophie asked, a question she had never dared to pose directly. "Not for a second," he replied without hesitation. "Every trial, every moment of uncertainty has led us here, to this life I wouldn't have dared to dream." He brushed her cheek with his fingertips. "And you? Do you sometimes regret saying yes that day?" Sophie smiled, shaking her head slightly. "How could I regret the path that led me to you, to our daughter, to this life?" The music changed, shifting to a slow waltz. Matthew bowed slightly before her, a playful gleam in his eye. "Mrs. Bennet, would you grant me this dance?" "With pleasure, Mr. Bennet," she replied, making a mocking curtsy. He led her to the center of the dance floor, guiding her with an assurance that didn't exist a year earlier, when his health was still precarious. Sophie let herself be carried by the music, and by the arms of this man she had learned to know, to respect, and then to love deeply. "Do you remember that promise I made you in the hospital?" Matthew murmured against her ear. "To dance with you under the stars." Sophie raised her eyes to the sky where the first stars were beginning to appear in the blue velvet of the night. "You've kept your promise," she replied. "Like all the others." Eleanor came to join them, slipping between them and demanding to be included in their dance. Matthew lifted her in his arms, and they continued as three, forming a tableau that summarized all that their union had created, not simply a fusion of lands or names, but a true family rooted in love and mutual trust. Later in the evening, as the festival was still in full swing, Sophie and Matthew discreetly slipped away. Hand in hand, they crossed the vineyards to the small winemaker's house they had restored, and transformed into their personal refuge, far from the sometimes stifling pomp of the main house. The interior was simple but warm: exposed beams, rustic furniture chosen with care, and everywhere books, plants, mementos of their life together. Matthew's cello stood in a corner, now regularly used during quiet evenings by the fire. "I have something for you," Matthew announced, taking a small package from his pocket. Sophie opened it with curiosity to discover a finely chiseled silver medallion. Inside was a photo of Eleanor on one side, and on the other, a lock of golden brown hair. "So you always keep our daughter close to your heart," Matthew explained, "and I have another piece of news." His expression was so solemn that Sophie felt her heart accelerate with worry. "What is it? Did the doctors say something during your last visit to Boston?" Matthew smiled, immediately dispelling her fears. "Yes, they said something important." He took her hands in his. "They confirmed that my heart is now strong enough to consider expanding our family." Sophie remained speechless, slowly assimilating this information. They had talked about a second child, but always as a distant dream, subordinate to the complete improvement of Matthew's health. "How you mean?" "I mean that if you wish it too, we could give Eleanor a little brother or sister," he confirmed, his eyes shining with contained emotion. In response, Sophie threw herself into his arms, letting the tears of joy she had been holding back flow freely. They remained embraced for a long time, savoring this moment of pure happiness, of renewed promise. Later, lying in their bed, Sophie contemplated the stars visible through the open window. The light breeze carried the scent of the vines, and the late roses still blooming in the small garden she had created. "Do you know what day it is?" Matthew suddenly asked, gently caressing her hair. "The first day of the harvest," she replied, perplexed. "Not only." He smiled, enigmatic. "It's also the anniversary of our meeting, the day when everything began, even though we didn't know it yet." Sophie reflected, mentally calculating. He was right. It was exactly 2 years after that fateful day when she had entered the notary's office in San Francisco, her heart heavy and her soul resigned. "Life is strangely cyclical," she murmured. "We are harvesting today what we sowed then without even knowing it." Matthew nodded, his expression becoming more serious. "I'd like to make you a real proposal, Sophie. Not like the one in the hospital, dictated by urgency and the emotion of the moment." He rose and went to fetch something from a drawer in the dresser. Returning to her, he knelt at the edge of the bed, holding a small carved wooden box. "Sophie Miller Bennett," he began, his voice slightly trembling. "These 2 years have taught me that true love is not an instant fairy tale, but a patient construction, day after day, through trials and joys." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold wedding band on which was engraved a phrase, "Feared paths sometimes lead to happiness. Would you agree to renew our vows, this time in full knowledge, before all those we love?" Sophie looked at the ring, then at the man kneeling before her. This man she had first feared, then learned to know, and finally loved with a love that surpassed anything she could have imagined. "Yes," she answered simply, "for today and for all the days to come." Matthew slipped the ring onto her finger, alongside the one she already wore, and the emerald ring offered in Boston. 3 rings, 3 stages of their story. The arrangement, the hope, and now, conscious and deliberate love. He joined her on the bed, embracing her tenderly. Outside, the music of the festival still faintly resonated, and the scent of the harvest permeated the night air. In a few hours the sun would rise on a new day, on a new season of their life together. "I love you," Matthew murmured against her hair. "Not despite our difficult beginning, but perhaps because of it." "I love you too," Sophie replied, nestled against his heart that now beats strong and regular. And I believe our story is only just beginning. In the sleeping valley, the vines loaded with fruit awaited the new day, promise of an exceptional wine that would age slowly in the estate's cellars, just as Sophie and Matthew's love would continue to refine with time. A love born in adversity, nourished by patience and acceptance, and finally blossoming in the fullness of a shared life. For sometimes, the paths we fear most are indeed the ones that lead us exactly where we need to be.